So I put this title up to scare a certain kind of person away who hates philosophy. Okay, so yeah, I won't go into my background. If you're interested, go to my website. You'll hear where I'm coming from. But I did want to introduce myself a little bit in terms of this particular topic. So where I'm coming to this topic of worlds and worlding is not like you guys. I've never played the Dark Forest game, though I've kind of seen talks about it, and I get the basic idea. I'm not a philosopher, but I do like philosophy. My background is in aerospace engineering. I've used a little bit of like academic philosophy in my work. There's a theory called possible world semantics that I used in my postdoc. Some other things you might want to check out later. I like to start with a bunch of links so you can go back later. But this whole track of thought for me personally began with this article on the design of escaped realities, which I wrote in 2015. And I did a whole series of co-blogging articles with the artist Ian Chen called Worlding Raga. I think that's how Justin found me, actually, which kind of really helped develop my thinking. I wrote a short story called The Map, which kind of gets at some of the thinking I've done. Went to the ZK workshop, understood very little. So I've been running this thing called the Summer of Protocols, and worlds were kind of an idea in the peripheral vision for all of us. But mainly I'm coming at the topic of worlds through the lens of time, narrative, memory, infinite games. So not necessarily the on-chain gaming angle you guys are here to talk about, but hopefully this will be useful. Okay, so I want to start with a bunch of warm-up exercises. So this is a classic philosophy question of, what does mean, what is the relationship between meaning and pointing? So the ancients didn't always know that the planet Venus was just one planet because they saw a bright star in the morning, they saw a bright star in the evening near the sun, and they had two names for it, the morning star and the evening star. And at some point in antiquity, as astronomy evolved, most ancient cultures figured out through like various clues that those two are really just one world. So morning star, evening star, both are pointers to the idea of Venus. But think about this question. Is there one world, two worlds, or three worlds in this picture? Here's another one. We are in a city that has at least three powerful histories. The story of Byzantium, Constantinople, and Istanbul. They all occupy the same physical territory. How many worlds are in this picture? 1, 2, 3, or 4? And this is not a trivial question. I'm reading this book by Bethany Hughes called A Tale of Three Cities about the history of Istanbul. And she's clearly an extremely talented historian and writer, but she absolutely struggles to tell a single continuous story of the city. It's not even just three stories. It's stories about three stories. So the entire idea of Istanbul, the idea of the city of Istanbul is accessed through like three levels of indirection stories about three stories that don't actually cohere into a single larger grand narrative. And I also wanted to mention this fiction book, The City and the City, which is a science fiction novel with the conceit of two cities that are coextensive in physical space, but they kind of overlap. It's kind of really, I also had the Permutation City picture up there, but then I removed it because I didn't think it quite fit. But these two books get to the idea that this is not a trivial question. And going back to Istanbul, maybe this is actually the true world of Istanbul. So I'm sure all of you have been walking around taking pictures of cats. I definitely have. And by the way, just to connect up to my first slide, this guy on the left, the orange cat, and the orange cat on the right, I saw this guy on the way to the conference in the morning yesterday, and on the way back in the same spot, I saw the other guy. I think they're the same cat. I'm not sure. So I'm going to call this guy the morning cat, and that's the evening cat. But, this kind of stuff about like meaning and pointing is not trivial. It applies to everyday life. Oh, and that's a thing I saw in the store of like a bunch of cute little Beanie Babies. And I was just thinking, I tend not to join tribes. Justin had this thing about three levels of analysis, individual, tribe, and world. I tend to think of myself as not a tribal person. But when I saw that and I sort of caught myself thinking about the cats of Istanbul, I realized I do belong to the tribe of cats. Like the only tribal marker I have no stickers on my laptop, but I am wearing socks with cats on them. And I realized that half my socks have cats on them. We have a bunch of cats at home too. Okay, so maybe this is the actual picture of Istanbul. There's the physical territory. The truest picture of the truest world picture of Istanbul is the city of cats. The only Turkish word I've learned so far is the word for cat, kedi. So maybe Katy Bull is the only world that actually makes sense. And then the human cities we are conceited enough to think of as the real worlds of Istanbul. Maybe they're like, higher levels of abstraction. All right, switching gears a little bit, since we tend to be extremely visually anchored in our thinking about things like worlds, ask yourself, how many worlds are depicted in this picture of like a standard programming 101 line, right? So if you are living in the world of string literals and wandering through the world of characters, and you come across this weird character called person D, that would be like a little portal in your universe to another universe, because if you look away and look back, suddenly that placeholder is replaced with the string 1, 2, 3, 4. Similarly, \n is an escape sequence where if you're in one world, it's like one character away, but if you're in another world, which is the rendering of this, you take one step and then you go to the beginning of the next line, right? So look at the number of worlds that are implied in just this one sentence. You've got the world of the code editor, you've got the world of the compiler, you've got the world of the operating system, you've got the world of the runtime environment, and you've got the world of the user of the program, right? So textual worlds can also be complex. Many of you probably recognize this painting. It is a famous painting by René Magritte. The French words translate to "this is not a pipe." So think of the levels of indirection here. This is me pointing to a projection of a slide on my computer depicting me several months ago at the museum standing next to a painting of a pipe which an artist named René Magritte saw like decades ago and painted and titled "This is not a pipe," right? And this picture is often used by philosophers to talk about like just how levels of indirection and overlays of like pointing and meaning are involved in like constructing reality. So is this a pipe? I don't know. This looks like 4 degrees of indirection removed from what a pipe is. And I wanted to again break out of like visuals and text. Think of audio. Like in this city, I'm sure many of you have heard that this is like, even though it's a visually very stunning city, the part that's really jumped out at me is the 5 times a day call to prayer from the mosques, right? The muezzin's call. It's a very audio environment. So the world is defined in very audio ways. And Taylor Swift, I'm not a big music fan of any sort, but this story really struck me. She made a very canny business maneuver of re-recording all her songs, her entire discography. That's the basis of this era's tour. And the business motivation is she just managed to like basically reboot the copyright, and now she owns all the rights, and she's become billionaire overnight by like rethinking the rights of music. So you can ask yourself in an audio sense, like a Taylor Swift concert is this huge all-enveloping audio environment. Which world do you live in? Do you live in the original recording world of Taylor Swift's music, or do you live in Taylor's version of 1989, right? So you can build worlds out of audio. Okay, so what are all the things we mean when we use the word world? There's been some formatting mess up there, so interesting abstraction leak. But yeah, bunch of things here. I won't try to go through all of them. I will call out a few of them. It's kind of hard to see my own highlighting here. But yeah, I want to point out that the idea of world is often used as distinct from planet when talking about Earth. And we mean that when we say the human world is very human-centric, right? So the idea that worlds are created around your own solipsistic understanding of reality. Forks can be understood as world. Think about the phrase, in the real world. What does it mean? When you use that phrase, what exactly are you pointing to when you use the world, right? And most recently, one of the things worth thinking about is AI training data sets constitute a world in themselves, and then the large language models that are constructed inside are representations of the reality of that data set, right? So we mean a huge number of things when we use the word world, and sorting out what all of them mean and how to use them systematically and theorizing about them is not a trivial job. So the motivating question for this actually started with a chat I had with Justin, I think a few months back, and one of the ideas he wanted to run by me was, can you use technology of the dark forest type and use it to solve the culture war? Can people who share values and want to create meaning in particular ways, can they just go online, create a virtual world, live there, live their entire world online? E-Online seems to be a community of people that kind of approximates that. They have their love and community and so forth. But is this a generalizable idea? Can you create entire virtually habitable worlds online, right? And an idea I came up with was called the cozy web, and it was in response to this idea from Yancey Strickler called the dark forest view of the internet, which is that people have retreated from the public internet and gone to like discords and messaging forums, private messaging forums, because they're sick of culture wars. And that's kind of like a very early version 0.1 of can you create your own worlds online? So different sense of the word dark forest. But is this a well-posed understanding of what reality is and what worlds are? So I'll start with one definition, and I'll give you a couple more through the talk. But here's my first definition, very philosophically, sort of like trying to be precise world definition. So world is a totalizing, immersive, and contingent, autocentric context whose presence is not recognized by the intersubjective plurality it centers until it leaks in some way. So let me unpack that a little bit. Totalizing, it means it covers all of your live experience, everything. There are no montages, nothing you yada yada over. Everything that happens in that totalizing sense of what the world is. It's immersive, which means it dominates at least the active sensory perceptions and maybe even the passive unconscious ones. Contingent, which means the whole world is wrapped around maybe an if clause of some sort. There's like an if something conditional, bracket, world. That's what a world is, in my opinion. Autocentric, like I said, it's solipsistic. It's built around how humans or particular agents view the world. And finally, intersubjective plurality. If you try to build a world around how one person sees reality, it tends not to be very interesting. Most interesting worlds crop up when you build them around a bunch of agents interacting with each other, relating to each other, but not becoming like, one cohesive Borg-like entity. They are a bunch of individuals who retain their individuality and relate to each other. That's what I mean by the phrase intersubjective plurality. Okay. So here's another version of the same definition. A world is a fault domain defined by how it breaks down in the face of what is not comprehensible within it. But all the fonts seem to have broken down, which is another interesting abstraction leak that's happened. Like the template they gave me is not what's rendering on screen here. So that's fun. Okay, so I think the main interesting analytical lens for thinking about what a world is the idea of an abstraction leak. And this is quite an old idea. It was popularized by Joel Spolsky in that article I've linked. He came up with this law of which he called the law of leaky abstractions. All non-trivial abstractions to some degree are leaky. By the way, that itself is an abstraction leak. If you cut and paste into a slide deck without choosing drop formatting, it'll carry over the formatting. So that's formatting from the original blog post. Okay. Another little joke of mine. This is actually an image of the template. But okay, let's look at some examples of abstraction leaks. This same example I used before, this is not quite an abstraction leak since it's designed by programmers, right? But it is something like an escape sequence is a designed leak out of one context into another. So this is kind of at one end of the complexity scale. The original idea of a bug is actually an abstraction leak. The term came up because in an original, I think it was a Mark II computer or something, there was a moth caught in the circuitry and the engineers figured it out. And I think this was the group Grace Hopper, who was involved in inventing COBOL. She, I think, was involved in the story, but they actually taped the bug in the logbook of the computer, and that's how we get the word bug and debug. And look at any electrical engineering textbook, and I'll guarantee you there will not be a chapter on bugs and moths. So that's an abstraction leak from the world of electrical engineering. Here's another much more technical example of an abstraction leak. So a few weeks ago on my WordPress blog, weird symbols started showing up. And I was like, what the hell are these things that are showing up in my blog posts? So luckily, one of my friends, a database expert, immediately recognized what was going on. What had happened was in the last WordPress update, the encoding of the characters that was in UTF-8, which is Unicode, was interpreted as this older character set called Latin 1, and then rendered in Latin 1 and then re-encoded as UTF-8. Which means the entire database was borked. It was full of UTF-8 representations of Latin 1 representations of UTF-8. So it required quite a bit of grind work to actually figure it out. But this is an example of an abstraction leak. You're not supposed to see this. Here's a much more sort of charismatic example of an abstraction leak. So in AI and robotics and simulated worlds, people often try to evolve intelligent behaviors through Darwinian mechanisms. But well, finite precision floating point math means you can get weird effects. So these are robots that were designed to, optimize some cost function. And what ended up happening was if they fell to the floor, because the finite precision of the geometry, the corners of the tetrahedrons would penetrate the floor, and the game engine would kick it out and to reinforce the boundary constraint. And when that happened, it would give it a little bit of impulse that violated the law of conservation of energy in that universe. And these little critters figured out that that was a way to get infinite energy in the universe. And the entire simulation got borked because the robots were figuring out how to effectively do perpetual motion machines. So this sort of thing happens all the time in AI research on evolutionary intelligence. So another kind of abstraction leak, finite precision. Here's a very different kind of abstraction leak. If you're from the United States, you'll recognize what's wrong with this picture. It's a complete LARP. It's a world of Republican National Convention presidential debates, but it's clearly living in an alternate reality, and I guess you can see why. Donald Trump is not here, right? That is the dominant reality. So these guys are holding presidential debates, and they are living in an alternate reality world that maybe only is meaningful if something happens to Trump on his re-election campaign and maybe he gets sent to prison or something. Then maybe this what-if world becomes a real world. But at the moment, it's like a counterfactual world of the sort, what if the Nazis had won World War II? It's that kind of world is what we're seeing here. But it's happening in our world right now. Okay, here's another abstraction leak. Have you guys played this video? No? It's not a video. That thing is not a play button. It's the little plastic stool that holds up the cover of the box, right? To prevent the pizza from sticking to the box. This was a meme that did the rounds. Everybody loved it. So this is worlds can collapse into each other through sensory degeneracies where they kind of lower the dimensionality. Here's another one, a little bit more obvious, a pie chart of a pie chart. I call it a Borgesian meaning-pointing ambiguity because Borges had this lovely short story about a map that's as big as a territory. Is this a map or a territory? Okay, so that's a lot of examples, hopefully, even though the title of the talk was about metaphysics to scare away people who don't like the word meta. I'm one of them, by the way. I like being grounded in examples. But let's get to actual philosophy. I'm not going to go into all this stuff, partly because I'm not competent to. I kind of understand them, but I'm not a philosopher, and I couldn't teach this in a course. But these are some of the terms you may want to Google if you want abstract philosophical concepts to help you think about all this. I want to point out one of them in particular, supervenience and subvenience. So the easiest way to understand this is think about a painting, right? And can you change the painting without changing the atoms that constitute the paint on the painting? Impossible, right? So that's what this relationship gets at, which is the painting supervenes on the atoms of the paint that constitute the painting. You can't change one without changing the other. So supervenience is a very important relationship in how worlds are constructed out of underlying realities. Here's another interesting building block you can use to think about worlds. So this is a graphic that really started my own thinking down this whole path. It's from Roger Penrose's Road to Reality, which is supposed to be like a layman's introduction to modern physics. It's nothing of the sort. I got suckered into buying it and trying to read it. I didn't get past the preface. It's a very, very difficult book. It's like advanced graduate physics. He thinks it's layman's physics. But he had this lovely graphic on it of there are three ways we understand reality, which is through the Platonic mathematical world, like engaging with the actual physical world of atoms, and then the mental world of like subjective qualia and so forth. And the thing is, these three do not constitute a stable triad for engaging the world. This is a Penrose triangle. It cannot actually be constructed. If you look at it, it looks like a coherent 3D object, but it cannot actually be constructed. It's an optical illusion. Penrose came up with this. And the reason he's depicting it this way is to kind of gesture at the idea that understandings of reality are unstable in this triangular sense. Okay. So just a quick summary of the examples we saw, like everything from regular in-world bugs to entire crashes of worlds. There's a point I wanted to make earlier in my abstraction definition. Sorry, I want to go back at it because it's important and I forgot to mention it. Okay. I want to point out a point in this definition of abstraction leaks are a subset of normal bugs that get at ontological failure. So ontology is a philosophical term about the nature of being, what sorts of entities exist, and how do you make sense of them. So they're like failures of ontological containment as opposed to epistemological failures of knowing. So it's not that you don't know that a monster is hiding under the bed. It's your world model doesn't have an idea of a monster in it, except as fiction. So if an actual monster showed up under your bed, that would be an abstraction leak. All right, where are we? Okay, those were my examples. Okay, I do want to add another tentative building block. That's why I pointed out the supervenience and subvenience. I like to think in a decentralized P2P sense, there's this relationship between worlds, which I'm starting to think of as paravenience, which is one world does not strictly supervene on the other or subsume another. It's like the two worlds can kind of leak into each other. So peer-to-peer version of that. All right, so here's a third attempt at a definition of what a world is. A world is the accumulating memory of a game that can be considered infinite until it is proven finite by an abstraction leak, in which case it can turn into a world wreck, a crashed world. So this definition is kind of very similar to falsifiability in science. Okay, I'm just throwing up a bunch of ideas that I'm playing with right now. That's why I said towards the metaphysics of worlds. These are not adding up to a coherent theory yet, but these are ideas I'm finding fruitful to think about. So I like thinking about the idea of ontological peers, which is two worlds that are capable of leaking into each other and destroying each other because each has first-class concepts that don't belong in the other universe. So I call that ontologically incommensurable. That means the taxonomy of the stuff in each world is not the same as the other, which means they can crash each other if they leak into each other. Here's another one. In a closed universe of ontological peers, there can be no stable subsumption hierarchy. So this is actually an interesting point with robotics, where many robots are built with layers that are called a subsumption hierarchy. I meant to mention something about robots earlier. So when I showed that picture of cats in Istanbul, the reason that struck me as more than just a trivial, cute slide of cats is so I'm part of this group that is trying to build open source rovers. One of my buddies is here, Anuraj, and we're trying to put rovers on the blockchain and so forth. He's working on that. But when I was trying to design my rover to wander around inside my apartment, I realized at some point that my way of being in the apartment and experiencing the world of the apartment was actually not very close to how my four-wheeled rover would experience the apartment, but it was actually very close to how my cat was experiencing the apartment. And that made me shift my frame of reference to, I really should understand the ontology of my apartment in terms of how my cat sees it. So my cat and I are ontological peers in the world of robotic exploration of my apartment. Okay. Conservation of leaks, this is another idea I'm playing with. In a closed universe, is it the case that a leak from one world is actually a leak out of another world? Another conjecture. What happens when you experience an abstraction leak? I think it's actually an imperative to either expand your ontology, which means expand your reality to accommodate the new thing that you didn't know how to think about before, or you die. It's like an existential threat. So if you cannot expand, you die. So this is kind of the mortality engine of worlds. And I came up with this triangle version of Joel Spolsky's original law of leaky abstractions. I think this triangle is true. You can't have all three at once. Do you want your world to be stable? In other words, eternal, EVE Online, can it be a forever game? I don't know. So that's what I mean by stability. Complexity, it's certainly very complex. I think that means you have to give up leak-proofness. The world is going to leak like crazy. There's going to be all sorts of ways the abstraction doesn't work in terms of the community it sits in. Here's another conjecture. This is, I think, the most interesting conclusion I came to, and I came to it last night. This whole slide deck is like a week of hurried putting ideas together. But I think actually leak-proof worlds are not actually desirable, and the most interesting worlds are actually not single worlds. They're overlapping layers and layers, which I think of as coextensive small world graphs. So that's a technical term of very densely connected set of nodes. But Istanbul is at least 3 nodes in a set of overlapping identities, plus maybe a fourth one about cats. I don't know, maybe there's 4, 10, however many. But that small world of world models that leak into each other, but not in a fatal way. That's kind of what an interesting world is. And if you take the coordinate view of like a particular world within that set of worlds, all the other worlds that are leaking into your world because you don't have the ontology to experience them properly, they will present as entropy or crashes or wrecked patches in that world. So if you're walking through Istanbul looking for the modern Islamic history of the city and you see patches of like, Constantinople or Byzantium poking through, not in the museums because that's a curated like, escape sequence. Like you're walking down the street, you see a bit of architecture, you notice something, it's like, this doesn't fit the narrative of a single city with an Islamic history. This is like another history poking through, right? So that's what I mean by, that's what makes this city so beautiful and interesting, right? Because it's not a single world. It's multiple worlds leaking into each other. An adjacent concept I've been working on a lot lately, I don't want to talk too much about this, but in the Summer of Protocols, we did a lot of thinking about this kind of stuff. This was my personal project in the Summer of Protocols. But thinking of like narratives for creating protocols as simply step-by-step processes of extending a story in a never-ending way. That's my idea of like a narrative protocol. And then a protocol narrative is that kind of story that emerges and it builds the world along the way. So think of it as an integration function, a generating function, something like that. So this is an adjacent concept to worlds. I think the answer to all these three questions are no. Can you actually use this world-building technology to create moral worlds for people with shared values? No. Can the idea of exit or fork be applied to entire virtually inhabitable worlds in the sense of maybe network states? No. Is the idea of like a cozy web as a retreat from culture wars and the dark forest internet a well-posed idea? I think the answer is no. But the thing is, these no's are actually good answers because you don't want to create these uninteresting, flat, one-dimensional, coherent ontology worlds to live in. You want to create these like overlapping, coextensive worlds that leak into each other in messy ways. That's what makes worlds interesting. So if you're trying to build a world like this, you're doing something fundamentally boring. Create something like Istanbul, not like, some abstract ideological village where only one kind of person lives. I hate that kind of project, by the way. There's a lot of those projects going on right now. So that's my answer to the motivating question, but I think the no's are actually a highly positive thing. And I'll close with my last slide of my post-assembly question. Yeah, just the obvious one from the substance of this talk. How do abstraction leaks define autonomous worlds? So that's it for me. Thank you very much.